The night I saw 52 missed calls from my parents. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because 6 months earlier, my father had stood in the middle of our kitchen in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, pointed at the refrigerator, and told me I was no longer part of his family. "Joining the Marines ruined your life," he said. Those were the exact words he wrote on the note he left on the fridge. Thick black marker. Sharp letters pressed hard into the paper like he wanted the message to cut. Underneath it, he added another sentence. "Pack your things and never come back." My parents believed the Marines would destroy my future, embarrass the family, and turn me into something they couldn't control anymore. So that night, I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply took the note off the refrigerator, turned it over, and wrote 2 words on the back. Then I put it back exactly where it had been. My father didn't even bother reading what I wrote. He thought the conversation was already over. What he didn't know was that months later, a convoy of Marines would stop outside that same house. And when my parents finally read those 2 words, my phone would start ringing. 52 missed calls. I was sitting on the edge of my bunk when I noticed the number. The barracks were quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of metal frames as someone turned in their sleep. It was late, well past lights out. But sleep hadn't come easily that night. Training days had a way of exhausting your body while leaving your mind wide awake. I picked up my phone mostly out of habit. The screen lit up my face in the dim room. 52 missed calls. Every single one from the same contact. Home. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. 6 months earlier, my father had made it very clear that I didn't have a home there anymore. The last time we spoke, he told me that if I walked out of that house to join the Marines, I shouldn't expect to walk back in. Now the same number was calling again and again, like something had suddenly changed. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. Because the truth was, I already knew exactly where all of this had started. That night in Oklahoma had been strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Dinner had ended 20 minutes earlier. The smell of fried chicken still lingered in the kitchen while my mother stood at the sink rinsing dishes. My younger brother Tyler sat in the living room watching television, pretending not to pay attention to anything happening in the house. I had just told my parents that I officially enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. For me, the decision felt clear. For my father, it was something close to betrayal. He had barely spoken during dinner. Every movement around the table had felt tense, like we were all waiting for something to break. When I walked back into the kitchen after clearing my plate, that was when I saw it. The note. It was taped right to the refrigerator door. My father's handwriting was impossible to miss. "Joining the Marines ruined your life." The words looked angry, almost carved into the paper by the pressure of the marker. Below that, in the same bold strokes, was another sentence. "Pack your things and never come back." For a few seconds I didn't move. My mother stood at the sink just a few feet away, rinsing a plate under running water. She had to see the note. There was no way she could miss it. But she didn't turn around. She didn't say a word. That silence hurt more than the note itself. Then I heard my father's footsteps behind me. He walked into the kitchen slowly, like the conversation had already been planned. "You saw it," he said. I didn't answer. He folded his arms and leaned against the counter. "As long as you insist on joining the Marines," he continued. "You're choosing that life over this family." His voice was calm. Too calm. "If you walk out that door," he said, "don't expect to walk back in." In the living room, the television kept playing. Tyler didn't come into the kitchen. No one defended me. No one even asked why I made the decision. In that moment, something inside me finally settled. All those years hearing my father talk about loyalty and reputation suddenly felt different. Because to him, loyalty didn't mean standing by your family. It meant obedience. I reached up and pulled the note off the refrigerator. My father watched me carefully. He probably thought I was about to tear it in half. Instead, I flipped it over. I opened the kitchen drawer, took out a pen, and wrote 2 simple words on the back of the paper. Then I taped the note back exactly where it had been. My father didn't even bother looking at the other side. Maybe he assumed I wrote something emotional. Maybe he thought it didn't matter. But those 2 words were not emotional. They were deliberate. I walked to my room without saying anything else. Packing took less than 15 minutes. 1 duffel bag, a few clothes, my documents. When I stepped onto the porch, the Oklahoma night air felt colder than usual. The porch light buzzed faintly above the door. For a moment I stood there looking back at the house where I had grown up. Most people imagine leaving home as something temporary. For me, it felt final. I didn't look back again when I got into my car. Now, months later, I sat on the bunk in a Marine barracks staring at my phone again. 52 missed calls. 6 months ago, my parents told me never to come back. Now they couldn't seem to stop calling. And somewhere deep down, I already knew why. Because sooner or later, someone in that house had finally turned that note over. And when they read the 2 words I wrote on the back, everything started falling apart. I didn't drive very far the night I left. Broken Arrow disappeared behind me faster than I expected. The familiar streets fading into quiet highway lights and empty gas stations. My duffel bag sat in the passenger seat like the only proof that my life had just changed. I ended up at a small roadside motel outside Tulsa. The kind of place with flickering neon and a front desk clerk who barely looked up when I signed the check-in sheet. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning spray. I dropped the bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall for a long time. It was strange. 6 hours earlier I had a home, a family, a place in a company everyone in town respected. Now I had a motel key and a future that suddenly belonged only to me. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the refrigerator again. The note. My father's voice. My mother standing at the sink pretending nothing was happening. What hurt the most wasn't the words. It was the silence. Because my mother had always been the person who softened my father's decisions. When he got angry, she usually stepped in. That night she didn't. That night she just kept washing dishes. From the outside, our family looked perfect. In a town like Broken Arrow, reputation was everything. And the Carter name carried weight. My grandfather started Carter Construction decades earlier with a pickup truck and a small crew pouring concrete driveways. By the time my father took over, the company had grown into one of the biggest construction contractors in the county. Our trucks were everywhere. Our logo was printed on job site signs across half the town. People respected my father. Local politicians shook his hand at charity events. Church members talked about his work ethic like it was something heroic. If you asked anyone in town about the Carter family, they would probably describe us the same way. Solid, traditional, successful. But inside the house, things were a little more complicated. My younger brother Tyler had always been the future of Carter Construction. Even when we were kids, my father talked about him like the company already belonged to him. Tyler went with Dad to job sites on weekends. He learned the names of contractors and engineers before he was old enough to drive. When Tyler turned 18, my father bought him a used pickup truck with the company logo already painted on the doors. "Future owner," he said proudly. No one ever said anything like that about me. My father used to joke that daughters build families while sons build legacies. He never meant it cruelly. At least that's what everyone told me. But when you hear the same message your entire life, eventually it stops sounding like a joke. The summer before, everything fell apart. I worked part-time in the Carter Construction office while finishing my last year of college. Most of the work was simple: organizing paperwork, filing contracts, updating spreadsheets for project expenses. I didn't expect to find anything unusual. But one afternoon, while sorting through invoices from several development projects, I noticed something that didn't quite make sense. A series of payments had been made to subcontractor companies that weren't listed on the official project documents. At first, I assumed it was just messy accounting. Construction projects involve dozens of vendors. Mistakes happen. But when I started comparing the payments across different files, the pattern became harder to ignore. Some companies appeared again and again. Large payments labeled as consulting fees with almost no explanation attached. A few days later, I stayed late in the office after everyone else left. The building was quiet except for the sound of the air conditioner and the occasional truck passing outside. My father kept most of the financial records locked in a drawer in his desk. The spare key sat in a small cabinet near the printer. I told myself I was only checking something quickly. The drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside was a thick folder labeled with the name of one of our largest development projects. When I opened it, several pages immediately caught my attention. Lists of subcontractors, copies of permit approvals, handwritten notes in the margins referencing city officials and zoning reviews. Some of the names looked familiar. One belonged to a zoning commissioner who had recently voted on a development permit connected to one of our projects. Another name appeared next to a payment that seemed unusually large for consulting. At the time, I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. But something about those pages felt wrong. Wrong enough that I pulled out my phone and quietly photographed several documents before closing the folder and returning everything exactly as I found it. A few weeks later, I ran into Harold Dawson while checking the mailbox at the end of our driveway. Harold had lived on our street since before I was born. Most people in town knew he had once served in the Marines, though he rarely talked about it. That afternoon, he leaned on the fence and asked a simple question. "So what are you planning after college?" I shrugged and gave the answer everyone expected. "Probably working with my dad." Harold studied me for a moment before speaking again. "You ever think about doing something that belongs to you instead?" The question surprised me. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. About discipline. About service. About what it meant to build a life that wasn't handed to you by someone else. For the first time, the idea of joining the Marines stopped feeling like a distant possibility. It started feeling like a decision. The night I told my parents, I had already signed the enlistment papers. The house felt colder than usual. Dinner was quiet. My father barely looked at me while he ate. When I finally explained that I had committed to joining the Marines, the reaction came fast. "You just threw away your future," he said. My brother stared at his plate. My mother asked only one question. "Why would you do something like this to us?" That was when I understood something important. To them, my decision had nothing to do with my life. It was about control. Looking back now, I realized the argument that night wasn't only about the Marines. My father's anger had been too sharp, too immediate. Almost like he needed me out of the house as quickly as possible. At the time, I didn't understand why. But the more distance I put between myself and that kitchen, the more one thought kept returning. What if my decision to leave had scared him for a completely different reason? Because somewhere in his office drawer, a folder was missing a few pieces of paper, and he had no idea who had taken them. The bus doors opened before sunrise. Cold air rushed inside as a drill instructor stepped onto the first step and began shouting commands before anyone had time to think. Within seconds, we were stumbling out into the dark, dragging our bags across the pavement while voices echoed across the depot like thunder. Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego didn't feel like a place where people arrived. It felt like a place where people were broken down and rebuilt. Move. 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 Boots slammed against asphalt. Recruits scrambled into lines that didn't quite look like lines yet. Someone dropped a bag. Someone else tripped trying to keep up. The drill instructors circled us like wolves. Within minutes, our phones were taken, our civilian clothes boxed away, and our names replaced by shouted last names and recruit numbers. Whatever life we had before that bus ride was officially over. For the first time since leaving Oklahoma, I felt something unexpected settle in my chest. Relief. No one here cared who my father was. No one here cared about Carter construction. The only thing that mattered was whether you could keep up. The first weeks of boot camp blurred together into exhaustion. We woke before sunrise every day. Runs through the training grounds while the sky was still dark. Endless push-ups. Obstacle courses. Drills. And inspections. Everything was timed. Everything was loud. Everything was designed to push you past the point where your body wanted to quit. Some recruits struggled more than others. One twisted his ankle during a training run and disappeared the next morning. Another recruit froze halfway across an obstacle wall and had to be helped down. No one laughed. Everyone knew it could be them next. The drill instructors didn't care about excuses. They cared about results. Every time my arms shook during push-ups or my lungs burned during a run, one thought kept pushing me forward. The house in Oklahoma. The note on the refrigerator. The words my father had written. Joining the Marines ruined your life. Every mile I ran felt like proving that sentence wrong. One afternoon during a field exercise, our platoon was lined up near the obstacle course waiting for instructions. The sun was high and the heat rolled across the training yard in waves. A drill instructor walked slowly down the line, reading names off a clipboard. When he reached me, he stopped. "Carter," he said. I snapped my head forward. "Yes." "Sir." He studied me for a second. "You from Oklahoma?" "Yes." "Sir." He nodded slightly. "Your family run a construction company out there." The question caught me off guard. "Yes, sir." He folded the clipboard against his arm. "I grew up near Tulsa," he said. "Heard that name before." The other recruit stood perfectly still, pretending not to listen. The drill instructor leaned slightly closer. "Out here," he said quietly. "Family names don't mean a thing." Then he straightened and shouted the next command. The exercise continued like nothing had happened. But his words stayed with me for the rest of the day. Out here, only what you did mattered. A few weeks later, during a rare supervised break, recruits were allowed a few minutes to check personal messages. Most people received simple texts. "Good luck. Proud of you. Stay strong." When I logged into my email account, one message immediately caught my attention. Harold Dawson. I hadn't heard from him since the afternoon we talked near the mailbox. The message was short. "You were right to leave when you did." I frowned and kept reading. "Things in town are starting to look strange." There was no explanation. Just one more line. "Be careful who you trust when you come back." The message ended there. I read it twice before the drill instructor ordered everyone to log out. The rest of the afternoon I tried to focus on training. But the words kept echoing in my mind. Strange things in town. Careful who you trust. That night, lying on the narrow bunk in the barracks, I stared up at the ceiling while the other recruits slept. Boot camp had a way of exhausting your body while leaving your thoughts wide awake. The documents from my father's office returned to my mind again. The payments. The names. The handwritten notes in the margins. At the time, I had only suspected something was wrong. Now Harold's message made those suspicions feel heavier. The more distance I put between myself and Oklahoma, the clearer those details seemed. I began replaying the moment in my father's office. The drawer sliding open. The folder filled with contracts. My phone quietly taking pictures of page after page. At the time, I told myself I was only protecting evidence. Just in case. Just in case those documents disappeared. But lying there in the dark barracks, another thought crept in. What if my father had already realized something was missing? What if the anger that night in the kitchen wasn't only about the Marines? What if he wanted me out of the house before I asked too many questions? The thought made my stomach tighten. Because if that was true, then leaving home hadn't just been rebellion. It might have been the safest thing I could have done. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. Somewhere back in Oklahoma, Carter Construction was still operating like nothing had changed. My father was still running the company. My brother was still learning the business. And the documents I photographed were still sitting somewhere inside a government database where I had quietly uploaded them before leaving town. The 2 words I wrote on the back of that note weren't emotional. They were a reminder. A quiet confirmation that something had already been set in motion. At the time, I had no idea how far those 2 words would travel. But one day, someone in that house was going to turn that note over. And when they did, they would understand exactly what I had done. The floodwater smelled like gasoline and mud. By the time our convoy reached the neighborhood outside Baton Rouge, the streets had already disappeared beneath dark brown water. Only the tops of mailboxes and street signs stuck out above the surface like quiet warnings. The storm had passed during the night, but the damage was still unfolding. Houses stood half submerged, their windows dark. Cars floated crookedly against fences. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked from a rooftop. Our Marine unit moved carefully through the flooded street with rescue boats and high water vehicles. The mission was simple. Get people out. Get them somewhere safe. Nothing about it felt simple once you stepped into the water. It was colder than expected and deeper than it looked. Every step had to be careful because you never knew what was hidden beneath the surface. Broken glass, loose boards, open manholes. The first house we reached had water halfway up the front door. A man in his 70s stood on the porch holding onto the railing while a woman behind him clutched a small suitcase. "We didn't think it would get this bad," he said when we reached them. We helped them into the boat without wasting time. The water was still rising. 2 houses later, we found a family waving towels from a second-story window. The father climbed down the ladder first. Then we passed the children down carefully while their mother followed behind. Moments like that didn't leave room for hesitation. Training took over. Orders were short. Movements were automatic. Every Marine around me worked like part of the same machine. For the first time since leaving Oklahoma, my mind felt completely clear. No family arguments. No questions about the past. Just the mission in front of us. Later that afternoon, we reached a smaller street where the water had risen almost to the roof lines. Debris floated everywhere. Pieces of fencing, broken furniture, even a refrigerator drifting slowly down the road. A police officer standing near a rescue checkpoint watched our team approach. "You Marines from out of state?" he asked while we checked the next house. "Yes, sir," one of my squad mates answered. The officer looked at the name on my uniform. "Carter," he said. I nodded. "You from Oklahoma?" "Yes, sir." He shrugged casually. "Funny thing, your town's been in the news lately." I paused halfway through pulling open a flooded gate. "What kind of news?" "Something about a construction company being looked at by federal auditors." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. The water suddenly felt colder around my legs. That night, we returned to the temporary command center set up in a high school gymnasium. Generators hummed outside while Marines and emergency workers moved through the building carrying equipment and supplies. I found an empty chair near a table where someone had left a laptop open for news updates. It took less than 30 seconds to find the article. The headline was small, buried near the bottom of a regional business page. Federal auditors reviewing municipal construction contracts in Oklahoma. Halfway through the article, the name appeared. Carter Construction. The explanation was vague. Officials described it as a routine compliance review tied to several large development projects. But the details sounded familiar. Too familiar. The article mentioned subcontractor payments and permit approvals under review. The same things I remembered from the folder in my father's office. That night, after most of the team had settled down to rest, I stepped outside the gymnasium to get some air. The floodwater reflected the emergency lights across the street like a moving mirror. Standing there, the memory of that office drawer returned with sharp clarity. The folder sliding open. The pages filled with names. The payments marked as consulting fees. I remembered exactly what I had done that night. After photographing the documents, I sat in my bedroom for hours staring at the pictures on my phone. Eventually, I found a state reporting website designed for citizens to submit evidence of possible contract fraud connected to public construction projects. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't explain the whole story. I simply uploaded the photos and asked investigators to review them. When I finally pressed submit, it felt like dropping a stone into deep water. I had no idea what would happen next. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. Another email. Harold Dawson. I opened it immediately. "People are starting to ask questions here." He wrote, "Some city officials are keeping their distance from your father's company." Then came the line that made my stomach tighten. "Your father has been asking around about whether anyone saw you take documents from the office." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Harold ended the message with a short sentence. I didn't tell him anything. The night air felt suddenly colder. For the first time since leaving Oklahoma, I began looking back at that argument in the kitchen differently. Until now, I believed my father threw me out because he hated the idea of me joining the Marines. But the anger that night had been too immediate, too final, almost like he needed me gone quickly. What if he had already noticed something missing from his office? What if forcing me out of the house was the easiest way to make sure I couldn't ask questions? I leaned against the wall outside the gym and looked across the flooded street. Natural disasters destroy homes in hours. But corruption moves slower. Quiet decisions. Hidden payments. Small compromises that grow larger over time. Somewhere back in Oklahoma, investigators were now looking at the same documents I photographed months earlier. My father didn't know exactly what they would find. But I did, and once those questions started, they wouldn't stop. By the third day of the flood mission, the water had started rising again. The storm system that caused the disaster had moved north, but the rivers feeding into the area were still overflowing. Entire blocks that had looked manageable the day before were now underwater. Our unit received new evacuation orders just after sunrise. A row of older houses near the edge of the neighborhood had been missed during the first wave of rescues. Several residents had refused to leave earlier, believing the water would stop rising. It hadn't. When we reached the street, the current was moving faster than before. Trash cans, tree branches, and pieces of wood floated past like slow-moving obstacles. One house had water pouring through the front door. An elderly couple stood at the second-floor window waving a towel. We forced the door open and waited inside. The water was already halfway up the staircase. The husband couldn't walk without help. His wife held his arm tightly while we lifted him carefully and guided them down the steps. Every movement had to be slow. A fall in water like that could turn into a disaster. Once they were safely in the boat, we moved to the next house. A young mother and 2 children were stranded on the roof. The latter slipped once while we were lowering the first child, and my heart jumped hard in my chest before one of the Marines caught the side of it. Moments like that didn't leave room for fear. You reacted first. You thought later. The final house on the street looked worse than the others. Part of the front wall had collapsed inward, leaving debris scattered across the entryway while water rushed through the open frame. Someone inside was shouting. We pushed through the broken doorway. An older woman was pinned beneath a heavy wooden cabinet that had fallen when the wall gave way. The water around her was already waist-deep and rising. 2 small children stood nearby crying. One of the Marines grabbed the cabinet while I crouched down and pulled the woman's arm free. Together we lifted the weight just enough for her to slide out. She couldn't stand. Leg, she whispered through clenched teeth. Without thinking, I bent down and lifted her across my shoulders. Another Marine guided the 2 children toward the doorway while I carried her through the water. The current pushed against my legs as we stepped outside. I focused on one step at a time. Get to the boat. Get her safe. What I didn't notice in that moment was the man standing on the far side of the street. A freelance journalist had been embedded with several rescue teams documenting the disaster. His camera was already raised. As we reached the rescue boat, the shutter clicked. Once, then again. That night, back at the temporary base camp, a few Marines were gathered around a phone laughing about something online. "Hey, Carter," one of them called. "You might want to see this." I walked over and looked down at the screen. At first I didn't recognize the image. Then I saw the uniform. A Marine standing in chest-deep floodwater carrying an injured woman over one shoulder, while 2 children clung to the side of another Marine beside us. It was the moment outside the collapsed house. The journalist had captured it perfectly. The headline above the image read, U.S. Marine rescues family during Louisiana flood evacuation. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "That's you." Someone said. The photo had already been shared thousands of times. I tried to shrug it off. "It was just the mission," I said. But the picture kept spreading. By the next morning, it appeared on several national news sites covering the disaster response. One of the articles zoomed in close enough to read the name tape on my uniform. Corporal Sarah Carter. Below the image, the caption mentioned where I was from. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Back in my hometown, people recognized the name almost immediately. Broken Arrow wasn't a large city. Everyone knew Carter Construction. Local television stations picked up the story and ran a short segment about a Marine from the area helping rescue families during the Louisiana flood. Neighbors began sharing the article online. Some of them had watched me grow up. At first, the attention felt harmless. Just another news story about the disaster. But journalists researching the story began noticing something else. The same last name appearing in a completely different headline. Carter Construction. A company currently under federal review for irregularities in several development contracts. Reporters started asking questions. Was there any connection between the Marine in the rescue photo and the construction company now being investigated? That evening, my commanding officer briefly mentioned that media outlets had contacted the base requesting interviews. Public Affairs declined every request. Focus on the mission, he told us. But before the conversation ended, he added something else. A few of those calls didn't come from reporters. I looked up. They came from Oklahoma. He didn't say the name of the town. He didn't need to. Later that night, I checked my phone again. Several missed calls waited on the screen. All from the same number. My parents' house. The daughter they told never to come back had suddenly appeared on every screen in town. And now the investigation circling their company was beginning to connect two stories they never expected to collide. The message came early in the morning. We had just finished loading supplies onto a transport truck when one of the officers stepped out of the command tent and called my name across the parking lot. Carter. I turned immediately. Report inside. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the tone that meant this wasn't routine. Inside the temporary command center, the air was cooler and quieter than outside. Maps covered the walls, and radios crackled softly on the table. My commanding officer stood near the back of the tent, speaking with a man in a dark jacket. When I entered, both of them turned toward me. Corporal Carter, the officer said. This is Special Agent Daniel Brooks. The man extended his hand. Federal Task Force, he said. The words immediately made my stomach tighten. We sat down at a small folding table. Agent Brooks placed a thin folder in front of him but didn't open it right away. You're originally from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, he said. Yes, sir. Your family owns Carter Construction. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming information he already knew. You've probably heard there's an ongoing investigation involving that company. I didn't respond. Federal auditors have been reviewing several municipal construction contracts, he continued. Some irregularities appeared in subcontractor payments and permit approvals. None of that surprised me. What came next did. Part of what triggered the audit was an anonymous evidence report submitted several months ago, he said. Then he slid the folder slightly forward on the table. Do you recognize these documents? I looked down. Even before opening the folder, I knew what was inside. Copies of financial records, payment logs, permit approvals. The same pages I had photographed in my father's office. The images were printed in black and white now, but I could still remember exactly where each one had come from. Yes, I said quietly. Agent Brooks watched my expression carefully. Do you know who submitted them? For a moment, the room felt very small. My commanding officer stood silently near the tent wall, letting the conversation unfold. I did, I said. The words came out calmer than I expected. Agent Brooks nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already suspected. We traced the report back through a public contract fraud portal, he explained. The digital trail pointed to a submission uploaded shortly before you enlisted. I didn't say anything. He leaned back slightly in his chair. You're not under investigation, he said. We just needed to confirm the documents were legitimate. They are... I could still see the drawer sliding open in my father's office. The folder. The notes written in the margins. Agent Brooks opened the folder and flipped through several pages. These records show payments to subcontractor companies connected to local officials involved in zoning approvals, he said. He tapped one page lightly. Once we began looking deeper, we discovered similar patterns across several development projects. I knew what that meant. Once investigators start pulling a thread like that, the rest rarely stays hidden for long. That night before I left Oklahoma, I had spent hours sitting in my bedroom staring at the photos on my phone. Part of me had wanted to delete them and pretend I had never seen anything. But the more I looked at those documents, the harder that became. Eventually, I found a state reporting website for suspected public contract fraud. The form was simple. Upload evidence. Describe what you found. Leave contact information if you wanted to. I didn't leave my name. I only attached the images. Then I clicked submit. At the time, it felt like something small. Just information placed where it belonged. I had no idea what it would grow into. Agent Brooks closed the folder. "Your submission helped start the audit," he said. But it wasn't the only thing we found. He explained that investigators had already uncovered additional questionable contracts linked to Carter construction, inflated project costs, payments routed through consulting companies tied to local officials. What I submitted was just the first thread. Once they pulled it, the rest of the pattern began to show. Later that afternoon, I walked outside the command center and checked my phone. The screen filled with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, several unfamiliar numbers, and the same number repeated again and again. Home, my parents, my brother. They were calling more often now, almost constantly. Somewhere back in Oklahoma, the investigation was moving faster, and my father was probably realizing that the report investigators kept mentioning hadn't appeared out of nowhere. Another message arrived while I was staring at the screen. Harold Dawson. The email was short. "Federal agents visited your father's office today," he wrote. He paused before the next line. "They're asking a lot of questions." Then came the sentence that stayed with me the longest. "Your father looks desperate. Desperate people don't always make careful decisions." That evening, I stood outside the command center watching the sunset reflect off the flooded streets. Natural storms eventually move on. The water recedes. Communities rebuild. But the storm surrounding Carter construction was only beginning. Investigators were digging deeper. Journalists were asking questions. And somewhere back in Oklahoma, my father was slowly realizing something he had never considered possible. The daughter he threw out of his house might be the reason the truth was finally catching up with him. The email arrived before sunrise. I had just woken up in the barracks when my phone buzzed on the small metal locker beside my bed. Most mornings started the same way on base. Alarms. Boots hitting the floor. Someone already complaining about the run scheduled for the day. But that morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. When I checked the screen, I saw the sender, Harold Dawson. The subject line had only 2 words. "They're here." I sat up immediately and opened the message. "Federal vehicles came into town early this morning." Harold wrote, "Several agents went straight to your father's office." Then he added another line. But that wasn't the only place they stopped. I kept reading. "A convoy arrived at your parents' house, too." The message made my chest tighten. Broken Arrow was the kind of town where everyone noticed everything. A single police car parked in the wrong place would already spark conversation. A convoy of government vehicles would be impossible to ignore. According to Harold, several dark SUVs and federal trucks had driven slowly down the quiet street where my parents lived. Neighbors stepped outside their houses almost immediately. Some stood on their porches. Others gathered near the sidewalk pretending to check their mail while watching the scene unfold. Then more vehicles arrived. This time they were green. Marine vehicles? The sight confused everyone at first. Most people in town knew the Carter name. But no one expected to see federal investigators and Marines stopping outside the same house. Harold wrote that agents approached the front yard while the Marines remained near the vehicles. My father came outside within minutes, even from across the street. Harold said he could tell the conversation wasn't friendly. Investigators began asking questions about company records and municipal contracts. My father crossed his arms and spoke for several minutes before one of the agents handed him a folder. Neighbors watched the entire exchange. For years, Carter Construction had been one of the most respected businesses in the community. Now, federal investigators were standing on the front lawn. I imagined the scene clearly. The quiet neighborhood. The familiar driveway. My father standing near the porch, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Harold continued describing what happened next. The agents asked a simple question. Did anyone else in the family have access to the office during the time those financial records were created? My father hesitated. Then my mother stepped out of the house. Harold wrote that she looked confused, like she had only just learned what the investigators were discussing. The agents explained that the original evidence report included internal documents from Carter Construction, documents that would only be accessible to someone inside the company. I could almost see the moment in my mind. My father standing there trying to process the possibility. Someone inside the family had exposed the records. Someone who had access to the office. Someone who had been in that house. Then Harold wrote something that made my heart slow down. Your mother suddenly remembered the note on the refrigerator. For months, the paper had stayed exactly where I left it. No one had touched it. No one had bothered turning it over. Until that morning. Harold said my mother went back inside the house while investigators continued speaking with my father in the yard. A few minutes later, she returned holding the piece of paper. The same sheet my father had taped to the refrigerator 6 months earlier. Joining the Marines ruined your life. Pack your things and never come back. My father probably thought that was the only message written on it. But my mother turned the paper over in front of him and finally read what I had written on the back. 2 words. Report filed. Harold wrote that my father stared at the paper for several seconds without speaking. The meaning was obvious. The evidence report that triggered the federal audit had been submitted long before the investigators arrived. Before the argument in the kitchen. Before he forced me out of the house. Before the company even realized someone had noticed the documents. The daughter he believed had ruined her life had already set the investigation in motion. Outside, the neighbors were still watching. The same community that once admired Carter Construction was now witnessing federal agents questioning the man who built it. Harold said the atmosphere on the street had become strangely quiet. No shouting. No dramatic arrests. Just the slow realization spreading through the crowd that something serious was happening. I sat on my bunk reading the message again. The barracks around me were already coming alive with movement as Marines prepared for morning training. But my attention stayed fixed on the phone in my hand. Because at the bottom of Harold's email, he added one final sentence. Your father started making calls right after that. A lot of them. I looked at my phone screen again. The call log filled the display. Missed calls stacked on top of each other. The same number repeating over and over. Home. 52 missed calls. 6 months ago, my parents told me the Marines had ruined my life. Now, a convoy of Marines had stopped outside their house. And for the first time, they understood something they never expected. The decision they tried to stop was the reason the truth finally reached their front door. The phone started ringing again before I had time to decide what to do. I was still sitting on the edge of my bunk, staring at the message Harold sent, when the screen lit up in my hand. Home. For a moment, I just watched it vibrate. 6 months earlier, that same number had delivered the last words my father ever said to me. Pack your things and never come back. Now the phone wouldn't stop ringing. I let it ring until the call ended. Then it rang again. The 3rd time. I answered. Neither of us spoke at first. The connection carried a faint static sound, like the distance between Oklahoma and the base had weight. Then I heard my father's voice. It sounded different. Not louder. Not angrier. Just uncertain. Sarah. I leaned back against the metal frame of the bunk. Yes? Another long silence followed. For most of my life, my father had never struggled to find words. He was the kind of man who filled every room with confidence and decisions. But now his voice moved slowly. We had people here this morning, he said. I know. He exhaled softly. Federal investigators. Marines, too. I didn't answer. They showed me documents, he continued. Contracts. Payments. He paused. Then your mother brought out that note. I closed my eyes for a moment. The kitchen flashed in my memory again. The refrigerator. The paper taped to the door. The moment I flipped it over and wrote 2 words. My father spoke again. Did you file that report? There it was. The question that had been waiting 6 months to be asked. Yes, I said. The word felt steady leaving my mouth. On the other end of the line, I could hear him breathing. You should have come to me first. I almost laughed at that. You would have listened. The silence answered for him. My company employs hundreds of people, he said after a moment. You have any idea what this investigation could do to them? I know exactly what corruption does to people. I replied quietly. That money came from public projects. Another pause. You think the world is that simple? He asked. No, I said. But honesty is. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his voice returned. Lower this time. I didn't think you'd go that far. The words hung between us. And in that moment, I realized something. My father had never really believed I would challenge him. Not as a daughter. Not as a person. Not as someone capable of standing against the family name. The girl he tried to control had grown into someone he didn't understand anymore. We talked for another few minutes. Not arguing. Just circling around the truth neither of us could avoid. He tried to explain the pressures of running a company. The compromises businesses make to win contracts. The deals that happen quietly in industries most people never see. I listened. Then I told him something he had taught me long ago. When something's wrong, you fix it before it gets worse. He didn't respond to that, because the lesson had come from him. Eventually, I heard another voice in the background. My mother? Let me talk to her. A moment later, the phone shifted. Sarah? Her voice sounded softer than I remembered. Yes. Mom? I saw the picture, she said. The one from the flood. For a second, I didn't understand what she meant. Then I remembered the photograph. The journalist's camera catching the moment in the water. Carrying the injured woman. 2 children beside me. That's all over town now, she said quietly. People always knew you as your father's daughter. Now they see something else. The words surprised me. We didn't understand what you were becoming, she added. There was emotion in her voice. But it wasn't exactly an apology. More like realization. We thought you were throwing your future away, she said. I know. And maybe, she continued slowly, we didn't listen when we should have. The sentence lingered between us. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first crack in the wall between us. After the call ended, I set the phone down on the small locker beside my bed. The barracks had quieted again. Most of the other Marines had already fallen asleep. Outside the window, the night air was still. Somewhere far away in Oklahoma, investigators were probably still reviewing documents connected to Carter construction. The outcome of that investigation would take time. Months. Maybe years. But something important had already happened. The truth was no longer hidden. I leaned back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. 6 months earlier, my father believed joining the Marines had ruined my life. Now that same decision had given me the courage to do something he never expected. Tell the truth. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. Just because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes justice doesn't look like a dramatic victory. Sometimes it's simply refusing to stay silent. So now I want to ask you something. If you were standing in that kitchen that night, if you had seen those documents, would you have stayed quiet to protect your family? Or would you have done the same thing I did? Let me know what you think. I read your stories and your experiences in the comments all the time, and they're often just as powerful as the one you heard today. And if you enjoy real stories about family drama, betrayal, justice, and the moments when people finally stand up for themselves, make sure you stay here with us. Subscribe to the channel and join this community. Because sometimes the most important battles in life aren't fought in public. They're fought inside families. And sometimes, telling the truth is the bravest choice anyone can make.